On September 25, 1983, the body of Louis Masquet was discovered near a park in New York. He had been missing for over 2 years, but he was found in the same clothes that he was last seen in. Though it was easy to see that he was killed by a gunshot wound to the head, the medical examiner found something very strange during the autopsy. He discovered that even though it was a relatively warm September day, there were ice crystals inside the body. Someone had frozen the body for a long period of time and then dumped it to make it look like he only recently died. This led local media to coin the term the Iceman for whoever the killer was. Well, the killer was Richard Kuklinski, and he had a few other names as well, to include the Pollock, Big Rich, and even the devil himself. You see, Richard Kuklinski wasn't some low-level killer who didn't know how to dispose of a body. According to Richard, he was one of, if not the, most feared and hated, notorious and cold mafia hitman in history, with a victim list totaling over 200 people. Find out if Richard was really the murderous villain he claimed to be, or just some wannabe hoping to capitalize on his 10 minutes of attention on today's episode of the TM Podcast. Welcome back to the TM Podcast. I hope you're having a great day. And before I get started, I'd like to do a quick shout out to Patreon subscriber Adam, who selected this episode for this week. I spent way too much time researching this one, and I enjoyed it. I really like looking into it, so thanks, man. So thanks everybody for coming to the channel on YouTube. I think that last week did decently well, so I will continue to record in this format for the channel. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want to see more of it. But generally, thanks to everyone for supporting me on any form of media. I hope you guys stick around. If you listen to the episode already on Spotify, Apple, or whatever you listen on, you're probably wondering why I didn't start the episode off with Richard actually talking in an interview. And it's because when I was trying to do this and try to upload everything, I found out that that was copyrighted material. Didn't know. My bad. Still new to the YouTube thing, so yikes. Whoops. I feel like I have to give you a disclaimer for this episode. Most, if not all, of this information comes from Richard directly, and his crimes are heavily debated. So I'm going to give you the information as it's stated from him, and at the end, I'll go over all the facts, and you can decide what you really think that he was and what you really think he did. So, Richard Leonard Kuklinski, or Dick Kuk for short, was born on April 11th, 1935 in Jersey City, New Jersey. He was the son of Stanley Kuklinski and Anna McAnally. According to Richard, they were both abusive. Stanley was a drunk that would fly into fits of rage and beat Richard regularly, and his mother was no different. He would later say that one of his biggest regrets in life was not killing his father. During this time, he would take his anger out by killing local dogs and cats in different ways depending on his mood. For example, he would tie cats' tails together and throw them over clotheslines so that they had to fight each other to death. He would also put strays into incinerators and just watch them die. In 1941, one of his brothers was beaten to death by his father, who lied to police and said that he had fallen down some stairs. After this incident, his father walked away from the family and would only show up at completely random times just to beat the kids, scream and throw things, and leave again. As Richard was growing up, he discovered that he didn't always have to be the one that was bullied. He decided that he wasn't going to let people walk all over him and started to take things into his own hands. He said that when he was around 14 years old, there were some local kids that would always pick on him. He said that he saw one of the kids alone one day and beat him to death with a clothes hanging rod. In one version of his story, he says that he then ran back home and the police never linked him to the crime, but in an interview with Philip Carlo, he told him that he stole a car, drove him to the woods, removed his teeth and fingertips, and dumped him into a frozen pond. I'll let you decide which version of that story that you believe to be true. After this, he became known to the locals as a pool shark with a hair-trigger temperament that would just fight anyone who crossed him in any way. At this time, he met and married a woman named Linda. Linda quickly realized that Richard was not the man that she originally met. He was essentially a living version of Jekyll and Hyde, being nice and normal in 1 minute and then assaulting her and breaking things in the next. While still married to Linda, he met another woman named Barbara who worked as a secretary at his job. He quickly fell in love with her and wanted to spend all of his time in her presence. She felt the same way, but she felt that they were becoming too close too fast and he was still married, so she told him that they should take a step back. He responded by stabbing her in the back and saying that she could never leave. Now personally, I've overlooked some massive red flags in relationships, but I feel like being stabbed in the back with a knife over the slightest hint of space is the biggest possible sign that you should just turn and run away immediately. But she didn't, and they got married. She experienced the exact same bipolar abuse of Richard that Linda had before. During this time, he realized that just working a regular job would not support the family life that he wanted. He had to find a way to spoil his new wife and new kids, so he turned to crime. At the time, he worked in a film lab, so he started making bootlegs of popular movies and selling them to people for cheaper than it would cost to go see them. He then discovered that there was an enormous amount of money to be made by bootlegging porn and selling it. That's incredibly weird to think about now. You could grab your phone right now and just in seconds find any porn or any movie you want for free. And he was making a living off of it. He also started stealing things and selling drugs, as you do, transitioning himself to a full-time criminal. He states that he also began killing people during this time for additional income. His home life became more and more lavish as the money came in. He began buying Barbara and the kids expensive clothes and showering them with gifts whenever he could, which made his neighbors believe that he was just another successful businessman. The family believed that as well and were too scared to ask where the money was coming from or why Richard would leave the house in the middle of the night. They would just be happy that at the time he was in a good mood, as he would go through phases of being nice for weeks at a time before becoming angry, beating them, yelling, and throwing things. At some point during the growth of his illegal activities, Richard took a loan from a loan shark. The loan shark wasn't just any old payday advance place, but it was one that was ran by the incredibly well-known Gambino crime family. When he missed one of his payments, Roy DeMeo, a well-known mob associate, sent some guys out to rough him up. They beat him up, but apparently DeMeo was so impressed at the fight that he put up that he wanted to hire him as an enforcer. According to Richard, the enforcer role eventually graduated to full-blown hired hitman. Richard claims to have killed frequently during this time, accepting large sums of money to go out and kill people that no one else could. He said that eventually he got the call that Roy DeMeo himself needed to be killed, and he was the only person that was trusted enough to get close. He says that he killed him and stuffed him into a trunk where he was later found. In 1980, he met a man named Robert Prongay, or Prong, I'm really not sure, who is also a well-known killer that drove an ice cream truck around looking for potential victims. He told Richard he was a former special operations veteran and taught Richard about cyanide and how easy it was to kill with. They became close friends and allegedly carried out several murders together. It didn't last very long, as they had a falling out when Robert asked him to kill his ex-wife and son. Richard refused as, according to him, he did not kill women and children. I guess beating them half to death is fine, but for some reason, he draws the line there at murder. I don't get it. After that, Robert let Richard know that he had planned on poisoning an entire water reservoir with ricin to kill as many people as possible. When Richard said that that would be a bad idea, Robert told him that he knew where he lived and he would kill his whole family if he didn't follow along. Robert was later found murdered in his ice cream truck with 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. In February of 1980, while driving to New Jersey, Richard got into an argument with one of his associates named George Maliband. Richard said that they had gotten into an argument in which Richard threatened his family, so he pulled the van that they were driving over and shot him 5 times in the chest. After that, Richard just kept driving, I guess, with a dead body in there, got to his destination, and then stuffed him into a 55-gallon drum after cutting the tendons in his legs so that he would fit. He then dumped the barrel by a chemical plant in Jersey City. When the body was discovered, Richard was a prime suspect because he was the last person to be seen with him, according to George's brother. Even though he was a suspect, they had no real way of proving that it was him, and he wasn't arrested. In 1982, Richard met a man named Paul Hoffman. Paul ran a pharmacy and had heard that Richard could help him get a drug called Tagamet, which was used to treat ulcers. Paul wanted to get the drug from Richard so that he could turn a large profit in his store. Richard agreed to the deal and told Paul to meet him up and bring $25,000 in cash. When they met up, Richard verified that the money was there and then told Paul that there was no deal and then shot him in the face. The first shot didn't kill him somehow, so he tried to shoot him again, but the gun jammed. So then he just beat him to death with a tire iron. He then put him into a 55-gallon drum and then filled the rest of it with cement and left it on a sidewalk near a small diner named Harry's Corner in Hackensack, New Jersey. After a few days, he said that the drum just wasn't there anymore. Paul's body has never been discovered. The police have been trying to build a case against Richard for a while at that point, and actually arrested some people that were in his group and placed them in protective custody if they agreed to testify against him. When Richard found out that there were warrants out for the arrest of a few of his associates named Gary Smith and Daniel Deppner, he decided that he would help them lay low by renting them a motel room. Gary left the motel room one night to visit some family, and Richard found out and got incredibly angry. He had told them specifically, do not leave for any reason. He decided that he had to be killed before his recklessness got Richard caught. So Daniel and Richard fed him a hamburger laced with cyanide, and when he didn't die as fast as they thought that he should have, they strangled him with a lamp cord and stuffed his body under the mattress. It would be several days before a manager of the motel discovered the body. Choking him to death proved to be a crucial mistake, as the medical examiner even said that he would have probably just assumed it was a drug overdose had there not been marks around his neck. At some point during the next year, Richard would also murder Daniel while he was letting him stay in an apartment that was owned by his daughter's fiancé. In May of 1983, a cyclist discovered his body on a trail being eaten by vultures. Police determined that he was choked to death, but thought it was strange that he had no defensive wounds and deduced that he must have been poisoned first. This would make 3 deaths of Richard Kuklinski's close associates. Now this is the point where the body of Louis Masquet was discovered, still frozen on the inside. Like I said earlier, he had been missing for 2 years before he was found, and Richard was suspected initially because he was allegedly on his way to meet him to buy a large quantity of VHS tapes when he disappeared. When police had looked into Richard, it was only because of some burglaries that were linked together. They didn't discover the true depth of his crimes until they started investigating some unsolved murders that they would eventually link to him. In 1985, police decided that they needed to find a way to arrest and convict him. Most of their evidence was circumstantial though, so they needed him to confess. Using a close friend of Richard to get them close enough, they had a man named Dominic Poliferone go undercover as a hitman to gain his trust. Almost immediately, they got the audio recordings of Richard bragging to Dominic about killing people with cyanide. After he built up some trust with him, he arranged a meetup to give Richard some cyanide for a murder that they had planned together. The plan was for Richard to take the cyanide and go kill a person that Dominic had said was an undercover police officer. After they met up, Richard tested out the cyanide on a stray dog to see if it was real, but the dog didn't die. He thought that was suspicious, so he decided to go home instead. He was arrested at a police checkpoint a few hours later. With the recordings of Richard essentially confessing to these murders, the police had all they needed. At his trial, his lawyers tried to argue that his recorded confession was just him trying to blow smoke to impress what he thought was a major criminal. The court didn't buy it, and he was convicted of the murders of Robert Pronge, George Malaban, Gary Smith, Daniel Deppner, and Louis Masquet. With the body of Robert Hoffman never being found, they were not able to charge him with his death. He was ordered to serve 2 60-year sentences for the murders and will be eligible for parole in the year 2046. Obviously, this just meant that he was in there for life, as he would be 111 years old at that time. While in prison, he granted permission to be interviewed by psychologists, criminologists, and writers. He said that he had a story to tell that they weren't going to believe, and to be fair, most people don't. He would go on to tell his stories of his upbringing and his early start in crime. He then went on to say that he killed over 200 people. These interviews were filmed and made into a docu-series on HBO, and there were books written and movies made and everything. These are the interviews that you've probably seen on YouTube where he's just listing off all these crazy ways that he's killed people, and some being over super trivial stuff like getting bumped into or just being looked at funny, and some being paid hits that he did for mob families. He made a lot of intense claims at the time, and it shocked everyone because here was this guy who most people thought was just a local businessman admitting that he was the boogeyman. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about every single claim he made because over the years he kept adding more and more stories to his alleged reign of terror, and it would take hours, so I'll just gloss over some of the things that he said that he did. He would always be super vague without really giving any names or dates, so it was really hard for police to try and figure out if he was telling the truth or not. He said that he used all kinds of different ways to kill. He used, quote, guns, knives, explosives, tire irons, fire, poison, asphyxiation, feeding people to cave rats, and even just beating people to death. His personal favorite was cyanide because of how easy it was to use and how hard it was to prove. He would inject people with needles by putting into a person's food. aerosol spray or by spilling it on the victim's skin. He said that his favorite method of disposal was to just put a body in a 55-gallon drum. He said he killed a random motorist who had annoyed him. He said he once shot a hitchhiker in the face just for flipping him off. He claimed to have burned a policeman alive in his car, beaten a man to death with a pool cue, shot a bouncer in the face in a club, thrown a man off of a hotel balcony in Honolulu, Hawaii, poisoned a stranger at a disco by spilling a cocktail laced with cyanide onto him, shot a passerby in the head with a crossbow just to test it out. He said he blew up a man who owed him money with a hand grenade, killed 2 drug dealers in Rio de Janeiro, poisoned a blackmailer in Zurich, bludgeoned a gay man to death for asking him out, and castrated and tortured a rapist in Miami and threw him into the ocean for the sharks. He also said he killed several people by feeding them alive to cave rats in Pennsylvania, and even filmed it. He also boasted that he was a contract killer for all 5 major crime families of New York City, as well as the DeCavalcante family of New Jersey. He claimed to have carried out dozens of murders on behalf of these families, and even claimed to be a part of the famous killing of Jimmy Hoffa. I know some of you are about to pop off in my DMs about that sentence with Travis. He said he didn't know, dude, you're lying, bro. But he initially said that he had no idea about it. I'll give you that. But then he changed it up and said he knew about it and knew who it was, but he wasn't going to tell. And then he changed it up again and said he was personally involved with it, and said that him and 3 other guys killed Jimmy Hoffa, put him in the trunk of a car, and crushed it, and it was shipped overseas. So do your research before you talk shit. So was it all true? Did Richard Kuklinski, the guy who police thought had only murdered 5 to 6 people, actually kill over 200 people across the world? Was he really so cold and smooth that he could kill that many people without it being known to authorities or the FBI? The police immediately started looking into each and every one of his claims, and even spent years trying to pry from him more information to be able to close cases that he seemed to believe were still open. In their investigation, he did give one name that checked out. Peter Calabro was a police officer who was shot by an unknown gunman in March of 1980. Richard said that he was the man that pulled the trigger, and he claimed that Sammy the Bull Gravano had paid him to do it. That murder charge added 30 more years to his sentence, but didn't really change anything as he was already going to be there his entire life. It was later discovered that the murder was not at all related to Sammy the Bull, and Richard used his name to try and extort money from him. And I'm not really sure that I understand his plan there. I don't know how that works, but whatever. It didn't work, and Sammy the Bull Gravano had nothing to do with that murder. So what about the other 200 plus murders that he claimed to commit? The supervisor of the Organized Crime Division of the New Jersey Attorney General's office said that he personally looked into every single rogue claim that he made, and not a single one was even close to being true. The people who wrote books around his claims would later recant their belief in the things that he said. The still living mafia members he claimed to work with all denied ever even knowing him, as well as lifetime mafia crime analysts saying that they had never even heard of Richard Kuklinski. Mafia writer and journalist Jerry Capisi said, "It is so incredibly improbable that some unknown mafia assassin who's never been linked to any of the murders he speaks of or linked to any of the known people involved somehow ends up being present and involved in 3 of the most famous mafia killings in history? No." It is noted that Richard's only real run-in with mafia people besides Roy DeMeo was one time he walked into a known clubhouse and bought a gun. That was it. I know what you're thinking. Why? If he didn't do that, why would he go on and on and on about all of it? Well, money. He sold his story to provide money for his family. Also, as we've talked about before, people confess to things that they haven't done all the time and try to be immortalized and feared forever. I'll never understand it, but it happens. Thankfully, Richard died in 2006 at the age of 70 of a heart attack after being diagnosed with Kawasaki disease a year prior. Is it possible that this is all a conspiracy and they don't want you to think that it's possible for something like this to happen? Personally, I don't think so. Is he a bad person? Yeah. For sure. He murdered at least 5 people, and I think he might have killed just a few more. But 200 people? I don't think so. If you watch the documentaries about him, some of his answers are just so cliche and cringy. It's almost like a bad improv actor was given the prompt, "Hey, you've got 5 minutes to convince me that you've murdered 200 people. Go." I encourage you to watch the documentary so that you can see what I mean. And even after all of this and all the information that's out there, there are people that are still thoroughly convinced that everything he said was true and he's one of the worst killers of all time. Even some of the bigger YouTube channels still push this narrative, podcasts as well. They act like he's some unsung hero that overcame a bad childhood and bullying to kill all the bad guys, like Dexter Morgan. I mean, he had a code, right? No women and children. No, he isn't some hero. He admits to killing people for no reason. He shot a guy in the face for flipping him off. That's not a hero. He also admits, and it's well known, that he beat his wife and kids all of the time. I think he was a serial killer by definition, but he was nowhere close to what he claimed to be. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments of this post or by messaging me directly at tmpodcast19@gmail.com. If you'd like to do what Adam did and decide what content that I cover or have access to several other exclusive perks, head on over to patreon.com/thetmpodcast and become a part of that family. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow me on everything. And once again, thank you for listening and watching the TM Podcast.